Hi, everyone, and welcome to ADHD Awareness, the 7 Keys to Unlocking Your ADHD Potential. It's Zoe speaking, and this is very unusual for me. Usually I'm the host introducing other guests and other topics, but I'm very, very pleased to be the person doing the presenting tonight, and I'm so glad that you've joined me. It's October, as you know, and it's ADHD Awareness Month. It's amazing to me how quickly that came up again. I guess I wasn't very aware, but anyway, here we are. So I like to think every year about ADHD and the changes that I've made personally since my diagnosis at 47. And for those of you who don't know my work very well, so about almost a decade ago, I guess, I started writing about ADHD and doing stand-up comedy about being a woman with ADHD, writing for magazines, blogging for Psych Central. Yes, and so this is me living with and thinking about ADHD. That's my website if you're interested in knowing more, and my Twitter handle. But I mean, the main thing for me was I really didn't know what ADHD was. Talk about lack of awareness. I don't have children. I only knew what the image was in the public media. So I really did have a big, steep learning curve. Some of you may have been diagnosed as children. Some of you may have been diagnosed like me in adulthood or later in life. So we may all be at different stages, but I think especially with the research and what's going on in the ADHD community, there's always something to learn. So I thought it would be very appropriate to have a couple of webinars this month. So as I'm sure you already know, the purpose of this one is we're going to cover a number of topics that are key to helping you flourish and thrive with ADHD. So we'll get into those, and I have uploaded a handout, as you can probably see in your control panel, and you can download that handout anytime you like. I will let you know that I have also uploaded it as a number of separate individual documents at a website called Dropbox.com. So I'm wanting to protect your privacy. If you don't wish me to add your name to Dropbox.com to a shared folder, if you could please message me either through chat or the questions and just say no thanks, and then I'll know that you don't want your email and access, you don't want to be granted access to our Dropbox folder that we're going to share. Okay, was that clear as mud? Sorry. All right, so again, Dropbox.com. If you're comfortable with sharing a folder with others on this webinar, great. And if not, just say no thanks. Okay. So anyway, yes, we're going to talk about ADHD awareness. And I'm aware that it's a completely different ballgame for me to be doing the presenting and the PowerPoint at the same time. So moving right along then. The 7 keys that we're going to speak about tonight are basically what is ADHD, but I think more importantly, as much as I think a lot of us tend to suspect or even recognize that others have ADHD, we have to remember that ADHD does tend to show up differently in each of us. So I'm going to do a little overview of that, hopefully very quickly. If you're already diagnosed with it, you may know this information already, but I sort of think about ADHD as a syndrome, meaning there are a number of traits that go along with it, and each of us has a different sort of grab bag of traits. And the next thing we'll cover is what are your ADHD warning bells? I started tuning in after I started reading about ADHD after my diagnosis to find out, what was happening with me when my ADHD was really, really tripping me up. Of course, there's always family life. So many issues in our families around ADHD. We'll get into that. And also work. Work is a really big one for us because the field of ADHD is relatively fledgling in terms of work accommodations. So we really need to do a lot of self-advocating, but we'll get into that too. Friends. It's amazing how much good or the opposite friends can do in your life. So we'll talk a bit about choosing friends carefully and how that can actually add to our own awareness of our ADHD. Romantic relationships, that's the big one. I mean, I think when adults have not been diagnosed, this is a really key area where our lack of awareness can really sabotage relationships. And I think most of you sadly might have already experienced that to a certain degree. The incidence of divorce and separations and just rocky relationships seems to be a little bit higher in those of us with, quote, the gift. And then finally, the big picture. For those of you who don't know, I'm not just an author and a writer, but my first degree was in philosophy, and I like to look at the big picture. I like to look at my life as a whole, as a combination of physical and spiritual and emotional and all that good stuff. So I want to include that component as well. I think there's some real opportunities there when we do look at the big picture. So we'll get to that. So I guess before we go any further, I would like to add, because I don't have a co-presenter tonight, I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. And if anyone is having trouble with hearing me tonight, please raise your hand, and all you have to do is just click on the hand icon to let me know that I should speak up, or alternatively, maybe tone her down. Okay, so the gift. What is ADHD and how does it manifest in my life? Well, as I mentioned, it does seem to be different in all of us, and we have different combinations of what goes along with ADHD, but there are some that do seem to be very common traits. We're all familiar with hyperactivity, disorganization, and inattentive. I mean, I hope we're not all familiar with it, personally, but if you have hyperactivity as an adult, common wisdom, literature, the experts will tell us that once we become an adult, that motor hyperactivity turns more into mental hyperactivity. We really are fast thinkers. In fact, a colleague of mine, Dr. Timothy Bilkey, has written a book, co-written a book called Fast Minds, and it also is a good read to help you with exercises to learn more and increase your awareness on ADHD. But he chose that title, Fast Minds, because it is indeed so common to all of us. You might recall a time when you've been in a conversation and you're getting, I don't know, frustrated, impatient, or maybe even a little irritable because the person you're speaking with just seems to be plodding along at a pace that's killing you. And we do think quickly, and we want to jump in, and we're worried we're going to forget what we need to say. So that's where hyperactivity comes in as an adult. But I will say, I still maintain that some of us adults are also physically hyperactive. I'm a very physical person. I'm one of those people who walks quickly. I like to move a lot. I really don't think that the physical hyperactivity is completely gone in me, and I'm sure other adults as well. Disorganization, well, need I say more? I think we're familiar with that one. Inattentive is another trait in ADHD that can dominate that whole syndrome. So that might be the one that's really the biggest struggle. And I'm sorry, I don't know what the current research is, but we once believed that women were more of the inattentive subtype of ADHD and men were more of the hyperactivity. So I must be an ADHD dyslexic because I sure got that backwards. Anyway, so those are, pardon me, core traits. And we also have the executive functions that people talk about. We often hear that ADHD is a condition that manifests impairments in executive functions. I don't really like the word impairment. Let me say that differently. We have different relationships to organization and prioritizing, time management, mood regulation, and these are all part of the executive function in our brain. Planning. There are others, but these are some of the primary ones where we tend to have difficulty. And the executive function is theorized as a part of the brain. I believe it's the prefrontal cortex. But nonetheless, the point is, I think these are all in our lives things that we can relate to. And I'm going to get into a little bit more about the mood regulation, especially as it pertains to women, because we have some very special considerations when it comes to moods, moodiness, and so on. So executive functions. Now, along with ADHD and the traits that most of us are quite familiar with, you know, it's funny, October is ADHD Awareness Month, but it is also Learning Disabilities Awareness Month. Coincidence? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because when I wrote about learning disabilities in folks with ADHD, I found out that an inordinate amount of people with ADHD have learning disabilities coexistent. So not just children, but adults also suffer from learning disabilities. I'm sort of theorizing at this point now that I have a reading disability in the sense that I'm a very slow reader. I love reading, but I'm just plodding sometimes. So that's kind of interesting. In fact, some experts will say that ADHD is in and of itself, by definition, a learning disability. And I found that quite fascinating when I interviewed an expert from BC on this. So very interesting. So that's another thing to be aware of. Impulsivity can manifest as verbal impulsivity. In my book, I talk about being blurtacious. I coined that phrase myself because there are studies that show that in girls at a young age, this impulsivity tends to be mostly verbal, and so I call that blurtacious. We blurt things out. And the impulsivity can also be just acting rashly, being impulsive, as it sounds, lack of social skills. This one took me for a loop. As far as ADHD awareness goes, this was a shocker for me. When I was first diagnosed, I had been belaboring for about 46 years, almost 47, believing that I had fabulous social skills. It was quite a comeuppance when I realized, au contraire. In fact, I had a lot to learn and a long way to go, which did explain a lot as it happened. So I had to start really relearning everything. And part of what we say about that is, if you're distracted, or if you're dreamy and off in your own little world, as a child, right from the beginning, you're not going to pick up on those social cues. You're not going to learn the social skills, at least not on the same timetable as other children. But I did want to share with you tonight that I just took this online social intelligence thing. It's probably not legit, but it sure made me feel good. Are you ready for it? I wish I had a drum roll. I scored 30 out of 36, and the test was looking at photos of people's faces, and then you had to choose what emotion they were feeling, and a lot of them were super tricky, and I'm super proud. Anyway, so I've come a long way, baby, with that. Social skills and identifying other people's moods and reading them. Hypersensitivities. Wow. Okay, we've got a ton of those, guys, and we've got physical hypersensitivities, we've got emotional hypersensitivities, and just like the learning disabilities trait, or coexisting condition, I should say, some ADHD experts, notably Gabor Mate, who's a doctor from British Columbia, Canada, who wrote a book called Scattered, which I believe I refer to later, he theorizes that the level of hypersensitivity that we as people with ADHD have is, again, that's his definition of ADHD. In other words, we all share that heightened sensitivity. So that's really interesting too. I've also referenced, I have referenced his book. So if you're interested, you might want to look that up. But wait, there's more. For women, impulsivity can manifest as a higher rate of unplanned pregnancies. And when you think about that, that has a lot of obviously negative repercussions. The level of STDs that arise in both males and females is higher due to impulsivity, promiscuity, that kind of thing. So it's a serious thing. It's not. It's something that really we need to gain our awareness on so that we can address and manage what's going on in our ADHD brain so that we can avoid these outcomes. Lack of social skills. Well, okay, this is shared with boys and girls, men and women, but it still, I'm sorry to say, seems to be that for women, we still suffer, at least in North America and yes, elsewhere, under the expectation that we are going to perform the lion's share of household chores, social convening, just all those sort of womanly prerogative type things. And I know that's absolutely not 100% thing. And I know that all kinds of the men here with us tonight, I'm sure, feel this too. But for women in particular, we seem to really struggle with shame and insecurity and just feeling terrible because we can't keep up with our non-ADHD sisters in our, keeping the house together, putting together a beautiful dinner party. I've had even young women, 23, 24 years old, whom I've interviewed say, oh, I just can't pull it together like other women, and they're referring to their attire, right? I mean, this is why I'm a gardener. I get to wear overalls to work, right? What do I have to worry about? The right purse, the right shoes, right? But I'll get to that later when I talk about occupation. So the hypersensitivities, I already mentioned this. When you have PMS and you already have bad mood swings, and then you add the mood fluctuations that certainly can happen just with ADHD alone, wow, talk about double whammy. I have a chapter in my book, ADHD According to Zoë, that's exclusively dedicated to these wonderful lifelong hormonal swings that women need to manage and navigate, and in different ways, especially when you have ADHD. So can you say natural born drama queen? Yes. Anyway, I think you get the picture. Oh, by the way, if you have any questions, I'm just going to throw this out there. Please write them in the questions panel in your control panel. So just type them in there. That would be great. And because I'm both running and giving this webinar, I'm going to try to keep track of all of this at the same time, but forgive me if I fall behind. I'll try not to, because I really do want to answer all your questions as we go, and I'll do my best. Okay. So, okay, actually we do have, oh, okay. Okay, I've got a couple of people who couldn't hear me a couple of moments ago. Are you still having problems hearing me? Please let me know. I can probably turn it up a bit. Okay, good. So if you're having trouble hearing me, please write something in the questions panel and I'll see what I can do. So diagnosis and treatment. When it comes to ADHD awareness, one of the reasons we try to become as aware about our own particular symptoms and when and where they show up is so that we can apply the right management or treatment or strategy. Because obviously the ones that cause us difficulties are causing other people difficulties. And I'm happy to say there's a plethora of approaches, and they don't all have to do with medication. I like to use a number of different things. I do take a stimulant medication for my ADHD. I find it helpful, but it's definitely, the pill is not an answer, never was. I'll give you that. And there are just so many other things that we can do. Sports is a fantastic one, and so on. I will mention that in the handout, I talk about 9 ADHD treatments. None of them are medication that you may or may not have heard of. You might be interested in having a look. Some of them are pretty cool, I think, and I've tried most of them myself and found them more or less efficacious. They do, some of them work fantastically and some of them work less so, but different things when you're trying to learn what works. And also don't forget that this does change over your lifespan, right? As we get older, we have different challenges and other things don't seem to be so problematic. So we sort of tweak our ADHD treatment. So there are a number of ways that we can look at how it manifests in our life. And because I'm leaving you some handouts that are going to cover this, I think I'll have you have a look at them. And also, we'll move on to the next one, which is yourself. What are your ADHD warning bells? What are the things that you can notice in your life that will tell you that an ADHD trait is becoming a challenge for you? And there are a number of different areas that I like to look at with that. There are 3 areas particularly: physical and emotional, and also situational. And I mean, these are relatively arbitrary designations, but I find them helpful when we're trying to learn about when our ADHD is going to be a problem. So, for example, physical signs. If, let's say, okay, here's a good one. If I'm going to do a webinar, I notice that my stomach is clenching and a number of different physiological symptoms start manifesting themselves. And why do I call this an ADHD warning bell? Well, the tie-in is if I don't manage to get myself organized enough and I'm scrambling for something at the last minute, then my body is going to respond and I'm going to have cortisol and adrenaline shooting through my body and I'm going to feel sick. And it's exhausting, and I'm pretty sure it's not that healthy either. So on our handouts, I've given you these 3 areas: emotional warning bells, and an example of that would be, let's say you're going to meet someone new, and that's always a challenge for you. I know for me, in some instances, depending who I'm meeting, it can be a really challenging situation. If it's a status imbalance or something like that, or if I'm feeling insecure more than usual that day, I know that emotionally I'm going to be anxious and I'm going to have a number of symptoms that are really derived from growing up with undiagnosed ADHD and making a lot of social faux pas. So situational is a problem for me. I'll give you another example. I met Dr. Ned Hallowell in Toronto. That's a city in Canada. And I was so excited. I mean, who doesn't have a copy of Driven to Distraction? I'd interviewed Dr. Hallowell several times, and I just think he's wonderful. He is wonderful. But man, was I nervous. And I was so nervous that I made a number of faux pas when I met him. I was so stressed out and anxious that I blurted out things. But you'll notice in your handout sheets that I've offered an exercise for you to test this out for yourself, to test your social skills and how you're coming across to others. And what I'm asking you to do, if you choose as one of your homework exercises is do what I did. I contacted Dr. Hallowell after our meeting, and I let him know how I was feeling that day. And he gave me feedback that I asked for about what he saw. And I'll tell you, these things did not match up at all. As you know, we're very, very hard on ourselves. But the contrast was absolutely mind-blowing to me. And I certainly learned a lot from that. And so please do check out, if this is a problem for you, check out the exercises that give you the opportunity to get some feedback and try and reconcile those two parts of your being, how you're actually coming across versus how you think you're coming across. There's a lot of incongruity for us, and that's where a lot of us get some really difficult situations. So your family, where do you fit in? This is also a big one, of course. Being aware, I guess I'll back up. These 7 areas that I'm talking about, you're not going to be struggling equally with every single area. Mostly what we find is that our ADHD just seems to be triggered in one or maybe a couple. You know, I don't think there's a study that shows this, but certainly it has been shown that people with ADHD, thank goodness, aren't typically going to struggle like crazy in all these 7 areas. So if you can identify which of these 7 areas, which ones are the areas that you have the most difficulties with, what I'm going to suggest is that you look at the homework exercise or the strategies and tips just for those areas and pick one and try it out for a couple of weeks. We'll get together at our next webinar on Monday the 26th, and we'll talk about what worked for you and what didn't, and we'll share some ideas. I'm really excited about that one. So what about the family? So if you have a lot of children, if you have children with ADHD, if you've got children plus a job, plus the kids with ADHD or other special needs children, you might be struggling a little more than I am getting out the door in the morning. I mean, I confess, I absolutely had to learn, you know, to put my keys on my little antique side table every single morning or I would regret it. But that's not nearly the magnitude of what other women are struggling with, as you know, getting the kids' lunch together, figuring out what they're going to wear. Honestly, I can't even wrap my head around it. But I do have some suggestions as well in the handout. So please do check them out if this is an area of concern for you. I also wanted to say about this area is that I think that, you know, in the family, again, as women, we are expected to do a lot of those domestic things. And I think sometimes that one of the best things we can do for ourselves, and you don't have to be a woman for this to be a good approach, but reframing and really focusing, or I don't want to use that word, identifying what your priorities are. After my diagnosis, I realized, you know, here's the deal. I am never going to have a perfectly organized home. I am never going to have a kitchen where the dishes are done 100% of the time, 24/7. They're mostly done. My kitchen is mostly immaculate. Well, okay, tidy, but it's not always going to be. And I've decided, and I mean this, I've decided that's okay with me. Okay, unless I've got company coming over and then I make the extra effort. But you know what I mean? I'm not Susie Homemaker, and sharing with you guys tonight and doing this kind of work is just so much more important than having my house be as gorgeous as, well, certainly not any of my friends, but the ones that we see in the magazines, much as I love them. It's really not a priority. Now, if someone else was presenting, I would be sipping my water and you wouldn't know, but I'm presenting, so I'm just gonna have a sip of water and we will move on here. And I hope you are writing your questions down. And I hope that my voice is coming across okay. So, excuse me, at work. I've given presentations on ADHD at work. And I think especially in this area, it's a very interesting dynamic because obviously the people that you work with aren't necessarily, okay, it's highly unlikely they're going to cherish and love you like your family hopefully does. And so obviously you'll be working with your colleagues, coworkers, your boss, your supervisors in different ways than you'll be working with your family. So being aware of your strengths and your aptitudes at work is really important. We all have to make a living, and having ADHD, sometimes that's just so tricky. So one of the things that I like to do is, okay, this is a very controversial thing, and I know that 99, a huge number, the majority of people absolutely would never share at work that they have ADHD. For me, who is, I don't know, what can I say, clinically honest, I just, well, okay, all right, I wrote a book and it's part memoir, so I really have no choice at this point. I wrote the book literally, so, but really that doesn't mean I have to tell all my employers that I have ADHD. I just happen to prefer that. I don't announce it on the first day, and it's really not an important part of part-time jobs or whatever, but for me, it's important to my personal, this is me, sense of integrity and authenticity, and also to my not so hidden agenda of trying to destigmatize ADHD, trying to get people comfortable with talking about ADHD and other mental health issues. It's a part of my life that's a really big deal, and I really have become very comfortable, but not in a way that I can't perceive that others are feeling awkward about a situation. I've worked really hard to get my social skills to a level where I have my spidey sense out, and I can feel when it's just really not appropriate. But for example, the workplace I'm in now is an occupation that attracts a lot of people with ADHD. And it wasn't too long after I started working there that people were saying, yeah, I was diagnosed with ADHD and I didn't have to say a word. And we were off to the races, sharing and laughing and making jokes. And it was really, really interesting. And that's how I like it. So other things about the workplace to be aware of. So finding out which symptoms or traits of your ADHD are the most problematic, the ones you really need to address and address them now, is key. So let's say you have trouble focusing, which a lot of us do, and you have to go to a meeting. A strategy that seems to work for a lot of people in that situation is to go for a walk, if you can at all, and especially if you can get outside. Even a 5-minute walk actually will help you focus at a meeting. Some people find that if they bring a pen and paper in and just make notes, even if you can't, honestly, even if you can't read your notes later, the point is that you're keeping your brain active, you're actually physically moving, and that can keep you focused. There's there's something called a smart pen, which will record notes for you, but honestly, that's too high tech for me, and I'm quite paranoid about technology breaking down. I'm going to have a drink, excuse me, of water. So I like to have a pen and paper, but it also addresses my faulty ADHD memory. A lot of us, this is I believe part of the executive function thing too, is short-term memory. So if you can manage to write notes that you can actually read later, that can help you as well. So what else about work? So find out, in your homework assignment, sometimes what I do is, if I know that I have to do something at work that I'm not intrinsically good at, that I have difficulties with, and I know that I have a coworker who is actually really, really good at that, I will ask them. I mean, I don't want to be creepy about it, right? I will ask them if I can watch them do it or show me what their approach is. I'm not embarrassed to do that, and you may have done this as well. But you've got to remember, in my situation, they already know I have ADHD. We've already talked about their ADHD little brother. So it's an extremely comfortable collegial environment that I have to do this in. I will also say that being more aware of my ADHD traits after several years of reading and learning and observing, I also sometimes in the workplace will talk about ADHD without naming it. So for example, I'll tell an employer who wants to teach me something, hey, you might find that I learn differently than others, and I'll ask them to teach me in a certain way, or I'll say, I appreciate that, if you don't mind, I'm going to take notes so I don't forget, for example. So I'm not talking about the fact that ADHD is really sabotaging my memory, that insecurity is sabotaging my focus, because after going for 47 years and losing all kinds of jobs, like a lot of us do, I can get really stressed out and anxious in a new workplace situation. So rather than go through my life history, which would be completely inappropriate, I'll just make sure that I'm sharing the ways that are going to help me to calm down and do my best at work. So those are a couple ideas, and of course in the handouts again, I do have some ideas for things that you can try. Things like accommodations, obviously, or maybe they're not obvious, I don't know, but if you need to move to a quieter place in the building to write a report, lots of people need that. It's not a situation where you need to say, I have ADHD and these distractions just completely override my ability to work. We don't need to frame it that way, but we can certainly, say in a non-ADHD related way, this is how I'm going to perform my best. So knowing the conditions under which you work optimally are really, really important. And again, overview, it's October, it's ADHD Awareness Month. So if this isn't a problematic area for you, then perhaps friendships are. I mean, really, how many of us have not lost a friend? I don't know. It's one of, I've found it to be one of the most painful experiences of a person with ADHD's life, especially if you're a child and you don't know you have ADHD. You may be bullied, you're different, you don't know why, and it can be soul crushing. It really can. Or your verbal impulsivity, and there's research that young girls in school are verbally impulsive and say things they otherwise would choose not to say if they could stop themselves, but they don't have the brakes, those biochemical mechanisms that other non-ADHD people have that control what comes out of your mouth. ADHD girls tend to become more quiet, not necessarily because they're inattentive, but because they feel a lot of shame about their behaviors. And this is research. This is clinically shown in girls with ADHD. And that can be absolutely horrific for girls, because not only do they carry this shame and guilt with them, and their self-esteem and self-confidence plummet, even if they have some wonderful, high levels of intelligence and all kinds of wonderful things about them, they'll never be able to meet their full potential if they carry this with them. Some even go into depression, and it's just not great. But friends can turn that around for you. Once you're aware of your ADHD, once you've lost friendships and figured out why, what was the behavior that led to that, and I do have an assignment that you can look at to help you pinpoint what is going on, then you can start to turn that around, and even to the point of having your best friend. In fact, I'm really fortunate I have a best friend like this, who will not only be your best friend, who will not only get a kick out of you because you have ADHD, but they'll be totally comfortable with, being sort of an ad hoc coach, not a professional coach, but someone who will say, okay, you're going out to a movie. They don't mind picking up the phone or texting you and saying, hey, we're leaving in half an hour. I hope you've got, your outfit on or whatever if you're going out. Now, that might sound like you're asking a lot of a friend. So I always say if you're going to work with your best friend, make sure it's cooperatively. So let's say you've asked your best friend to help you with filing. You need to get your home office fixed up, and she is a wonderfully organized person. So you need to make an offer. What are you going to do for her? Maybe you love hanging out with her kids, and maybe she needs a couple hours off. Well, maybe you'll go to the park with the kids one day. She'll come over to your office one day. There you go. We're bartering. We're helping each other out. We're filling in some gaps where we could use a friend. We also want to think about, are friends with ADHD a better bet, or are friends without ADHD a better bet? And this, I'll jump ahead a bit. This also applies to relationships. Well, that just depends. Some people with ADHD say that they love their non-ADHD friends because, they're calm. And, well, one woman I interviewed said she was 33 and she was diagnosed at 24, and she said her non-ADHD friends calm her down, and she enjoys their quiet and their calmness. And other women with ADHD, so for example, I interviewed Nancy Rady, who wrote the classic The Disorganized Mind. She's an ADHD coach. Well, she said, other women do not understand how hard it can be to shop at the grocery store. Like, does that sound familiar? It's fantastic having a friend that you don't have to explain yourself to on that level. And the way that I would suggest manages your ADHD is, again, this is rebuilding self-esteem. This is saying, hey, I've got this different brain, but I'm okay, and I'm not the only one. So, but then on the dark side, I interviewed another woman who says that she worked with another ADHD woman, and she said that her disorganization, the other woman, her colleague, her disorganization and clutter drove her mad. She said, quote, "We're both easily distracted and can let projects sit idly for months." But then she said on the positive side that she just feels better about herself when she's around this other woman who has the same challenges. So I think, again, when we're framing this in ADHD awareness, if you need to build up your self-esteem, it doesn't matter if your friends have ADHD or not. Do they support you? Do they love you just as you are? It's great if they mirror your ADHD, because that's a way of feeling like you belong. And let's face it, so many of us go through life feeling like we don't belong, especially if I was adopted. So I was the only one in my large adoptive family with the gift. So I really felt like I was out of it because no one else remotely had any of these symptoms or traits that I had. So having ADHD people around me is like having my people. We often talk about, it's my tribe. And it makes me feel more like, yeah, I'm not alone. There are other people out there like me. Same thing goes for romantic relationships. Being aware of ADHD in a romantic relationship. Wow. This is such a big area. This is one that has caused me, and probably a lot of you, such heartache, literally. Before I was diagnosed, I would be in a partnership and I would be spacing out. And of course, my partner would accuse me of being bored or not paying attention during, and unfortunately, this was almost always during, those conversations that you have where you're trying to work relationship issues out. This does not go over very well, and it certainly does not make you look like you're committed to a relationship or that you love your partner. And the saddest thing of all, I think, is that for me, none of those things, that's not entirely honest. Most of those things were not true. Sometimes, because I am aware, I admit that I was getting a little bored, but Again, I am now aware that that was because of the way my brain handles dopamine and other hormones. My brain chemistry is different than someone without ADHD, at least that's the theory. So we get bored more easily. Adults with ADHD do get bored more easily, and it's not necessarily that what he was saying was boring, but we just don't have that threshold that others have. Was I committed to the relationship? Absolutely. Did I love the guy? Yeah, I was crazy about him. Was this going to work out? No, it didn't work out. And I had no way of framing what was going on because I didn't understand it. I didn't have that awareness. And it wasn't until many, even decades later, that I finally was diagnosed and was able to go back and look back and say, wow, that's what was happening in that relationship. That and many other things, of course. So there are some great resources on romantic relationships, and certainly I am not a relationship expert, I must say, but I have interviewed many. Particularly, I think Melissa Orlov's work is just fantastic. And if relationships is an area that you would like to pinpoint and work on, I've listed a number of resources in the handout that you might want to check out. And of course, Melissa Orlov's work is one of them. Her most recent book, if you haven't already seen it, is called The Couple's Guide to Thriving with ADHD. I did a webinar with her for Psych Central where you can hear her talking about, things that she talks about in the book. So I've listed that on the handout, so you might want to check that out. But I'll just sort of go over some of the wonderful contents that she has that are just amazing. She talks about anger. I actually wrote a guest blog post for her about anger. This was a big one for me. People with ADHD tend to or can often be more irritable, more easily triggered to flashes of temper, and just generally have more anger than others. This can kill a relationship. It really can, especially if you're impulsively in a bout of anger, blurting hurtful things. We all have been there, I think, at one time or another, at least most of us. So Melissa addresses that. She addresses how to rebuild intimacy, how to rebalance tasks and chores in your partnership. But again, it all comes back to awareness. Are you feeling overwhelmed because you just feel like you have too many chores? You've got the parenting, you've got everything, and your partner doesn't seem to be doing, it doesn't seem to be 50-50. That has got to be addressed because, as you know, those of us with ADHD easily become more overwhelmed, and then things really start to go off the rails. So do look at the handouts for more relationship information. But remember always, just as at work, you're going to thrive and flourish if it's a strength-based situation. In other words, you're in a job that maximizes your strengths, be they, energy, creativity, leadership qualities, what have you, rather than your challenges. Same thing in the romantic relationship. You really need to look at divisions of labor, division of tasks, and reassign things, redivide them to highlight what you're good at. Also, this is really key for me. It's really important in a romantic relationship to not allow yourself to become the problem. Okay? If you're the only person struggling with ADHD and perhaps your partner doesn't have a mental health challenge, this can easily escalate into those of us with the ADHD being the source of all difficulties. And when you really think about it, you know that is never, ever the case. It always takes two to tango, and it takes two to tangle, right? So please don't take on all the relationship issues in a partnership. However, do remember that your ADHD, as you know, ADHD is never an excuse, but it certainly is a reason. And it's so important to keep that top of mind. But because it's you with the ADHD, or even if both of you have ADHD, it's your personal responsibility, of course, to manage your own ADHD, to be aware of what's going on with you. And that's why I applaud everyone who's here tonight, who's really making an effort to look into that, because you're the only one who knows what's going to work. And it's trial and error sometimes. You know, I've offered a lot of strategies that you'll take home with you tonight, and some are going to work and some aren't, and that's okay. I mean, I use a $3 kitchen timer for time management, and I resisted it, embarrassingly enough, for years, because actually I thought my hypersensitivity would have me jumping out of my skin every time that thing went off. But you know what? It's the best thing I ever did for myself, buying a $3 kitchen timer, which I set not just in the kitchen. I put it on my desk in my office. I time different tasks to move to different transitions. I'm pretty sure you won't directly be using a timer in a romantic relationship, but at least I hope not. I'm not going to go there. But what if you have a date? Okay, so you need to get ready for your date, your date night. Maybe you will use that kitchen timer. Maybe it's time management. That's the thing that's really sabotaging the relationship. Again, there's an incongruity in our actions and how we feel inside. And this is the thing, honestly, that I felt the most painful throughout my life pre-diagnosis. It's not that you don't care enough to be on time. It's that you're struggling with time management. People with ADHD have a very different perception of time. And that's not a poetic statement. That's a concrete reality. And again, the theory is that we believe that that's based on how our brains are wired, which is a poetic thing to say, but we do have a different relationship with time, and it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to get that kitchen timer and show your partner that you care enough to work hard to be on time. So, yeah, and please do look at, not only are you being made into the problem, because you're not the sole source, but look at what the communication with your partner consists of. It's one thing to be aware of your ADHD, but it's quite another to have a partner who is either subtly or overtly belittling, criticizing, and so on. That kind of pummeling communication day after day is not going to serve anyone well, and it's definitely not going to help you to thrive with your ADHD. We need support, we need partnership, we need good communication, we need healthy ways to argue, and all of these things are things to look into in terms of making your life and the life of those around you better. So I'm aware that, wow, this hour has gone really quickly, and I'm just sort of droning on. I really do hope if you have specific questions that you will get them to me. And I'm looking at my questions panel now to see what else we've got. Okay, so I hope everybody can hear me. And finally, ADHD awareness and the big picture. So what's my life purpose? Where do I fit in? And what I mean by this is, what's your life about? Is ADHD holding you back? Are you expecting too much? And I say this with a view to understanding that expectations that people who don't understand ADHD have of you may not align with what are appropriate expectations for you, may not align with even what matters to you. So again, another good the example of a tidy house. I've interviewed women, and I apologize to any men on the line here. I obviously relate more to women in ADHD, but I'm sure this can go either way. If your partner has an expectation about how your house will be kept and what kind of a social life you'll lead, and all that expectation is on your shoulders, and you find these kinds of things overwhelming, the prioritizing, the organization, just the sheer logistics of it all, just too much to handle, we need to sit down and ask ourselves, really, is that realistic? And it doesn't matter if that's the norm, quite frankly. Really, it's your life. Yes, it's your life with your partner, but in the big picture, how do you want to live your life? Maybe taking some time during ADHD Awareness Month to be alone in nature, to sit in meditation, to pray, to do whatever gets you into that, drops you to that deeper level where you're really in touch with the big picture in you. What gives your life meaning? What is your life's purpose? And I do have some suggestions for figuring all this out as well. So I really do think that this is key, because only then can you tap into your potential by either minimizing or not taking quite so seriously expectations that really aren't your own. And of course, when it comes to a relationship, if yours and your spouse's or partner's expectations clash, then that's where we get into some negotiation and hopefully a creative new solution. What does this now look like? Because really, if you're living a life that you don't want to live, it's time to change it. If you're actually having expectations that are too little, it's time to challenge yourself, take a risk. Because now, when your ADHD awareness has increased, you start to learn some coping skills and some resilience, and we can reframe what we often think of as a lifetime of failures and start looking at them as experiences on the path to learning more about ourselves and to being able to find ways to continue to move forward with a sense of humor and a sense of self-acceptance and a sense of joy. These things are all possible, and I would love to see all of you experience these. Now, I think it's that fateful time where we're going to look at what are we going to do in the next 2 weeks. So here's what I would suggest. Choose an area of focus. So which of these 7 areas, and there might be a couple, I don't know, but please don't overwhelm yourself by choosing them all. It's only 2 weeks. There is a whole year unfolding, and maybe we'll do this again next year and you can come back, and wouldn't that be amazing? I am sure you'll all make huge strides in a whole year. Wow. So choose one, okay? Or maybe 2. 2 weeks. And then look at the handout. And again, I do have handouts at a Dropbox file, and I can add you to the list. Schedule some time, put some time aside, and choose 1 or 2 strategies or assignments or just whatever you see there that appeals to you, but let yourself be a little challenged, okay? Don't choose something that you're already really good at. Find out which areas you really want to look at. Find out the areas that you're feeling stressed by and pick something that's going to address that for you, because at the end of October, by gosh, I hope all of you are going out there with a new sense of confidence and with some tools in your toolbox that are really going to help you to feel like, yeah, that's one part of my area that I have either mastered or overcome or diminished or addressed, or whatever it is that'll make you feel good about that part of your ADHD. So read those handouts, and please do sign up for the follow-up that's going to happen on Monday, October the 26th. I have already created that webinar. There will be a registration link, which I'll blog about, and in fact, at the end of this webinar, I will see if I can manage to send you the link through the control panel because we only have a minute left. Oh, so little time and so much to do. So thank you so much for sharing this blazingly fast hour with me. I hope that I've given you something something helpful tonight, but I'll admit I'm pretty confident you'll find something in the exercises because I worked really hard on them, and there's a lot to choose from. So yes, the handouts are found if you look at your dashboard, and there should be a little tab that says handouts 1 of 5. And if you click on the plus sign, you're going to see a handout called ADHD Awareness 7 Keys to Awareness handout. If you just click on that or double click it, that will, I believe, download. So if you have trouble downloading that, please email me, Zoe at zoekessler.com, and I would be happy to go ahead and send you the handouts and just specify which ones you want or if you want them all, and I'd be happy to do that. So on behalf of Psych Central and on behalf of myself, Zoë Kessler, I want to thank you again so much for joining us, all of us here tonight. I am going to wish you good luck with your assignments. Don't think of them as homework. Think of them as an adventure. I'm really rooting for you. And I know you're going to have some exciting stories when you come back in 2 weeks. And please do tell your friends about it because the more the merrier. And let's learn from each other and support each other. So happy ADHD Awareness Month. And do check out our YouTube replay that'll be up in a day or two. Okay? Thanks very much, everyone. And good night for now. Bye.